at the court of an emperor. He lived it matters not when. There was among the many gentlewomen of the wardrobe and chamber one, who though she was not of very high rank, was favored far beyond all the rest, so that the great ladies of the palace, each of whom had secretly hoped that she herself would be chosen, looked with scorn and hatred upon the upstart who had dispelled their dreams. Still less were her former companions, the minor ladies of the wardrobe, content to see her raised so far above them. Thus, her position at court, preponderant though it was, exposed her to constant jealousy and ill will, and soon, worn out with petty vexations, she fell into a decline, growing very melancholy and retiring frequently to her home. But the emperor, so far from wearying of her, now that she was no longer well or gay, grew every day more tender, and paid not the smallest heed to those who reproved him, till his conduct became the talk of all the land, and even his own barons and courtiers began to look askance at an attachment so ill-advised. They whispered among themselves that in the land beyond the sea, such happenings had led to 18 riot and disaster. The people of the country did indeed soon have many grievances to show, and some likened her to young Kui Fei, the mistress of Ming Huang. Yet, for all this discontent, so great was the sheltering power of her master's love that none dared openly molest her. Her father, who had been a counselor, was dead. Her mother, who never forgot that the father was in his day a man of some consequence, managed, despite all difficulties, to give her as good an upbringing as generally falls to the lot of young ladies whose parents are alive and at the height of fortune. It would have helped matters greatly if there had been some influential guardian to busy himself on the child's behalf. Unfortunately, the mother was entirely alone in the world, and sometimes, when troubles came, she felt very bitterly the lack of anyone to whom she could turn for comfort and advice. But to return to the daughter, in due time, she bore him a little prince, who, perhaps because in some previous life a close bond had joined them, turned out as fine and likely a man-child as well might be in all the land. The emperor could hardly contain himself during the days of waiting, but when, at the earliest possible moment, the child was presented at court, he saw that rumor had not exaggerated its beauty. His eldest-born prince was the son of Lady Kokiden, the daughter of the Minister of the Right, and this child was treated by all with the respect due to an undoubted heir apparent. But he was not so fine a child as the new prince. Moreover, the emperor's great affection for the new child's mother made him feel the boy to be in a peculiar sense his own possession. Unfortunately, she was not of the same rank as the courtiers who waited upon him in the upper palace, so that despite his love for her, and though she wore all the airs of a great lady, it was not without considerable qualms that he now made it his practice to have her by him, not only when there was to be some entertainment, but even when any business of importance was afoot. Sometimes, indeed, he would keep her when he woke in the morning, not letting her go back to her lodging, so that willy-nilly she acted the part of a lady in perpetual attendance. Seeing all this, Lady Kokiden began to fear that the new prince, for whom the emperor seemed to have so marked a preference, would, if she did not take care, soon be promoted to the Eastern Palace. But she had, after all, priority over her rival. The emperor had loved her devotedly, and she had borne him princes. It was even now chiefly the fear of her reproaches that made him uneasy about his new way of life. Thus, Though his mistress could be sure of his protection, there were many who sought to humiliate her, and she felt so weak in herself that it seemed to her at last as though all the honors heaped upon her had brought with them terror rather than joy. Her lodging was in the wing called Kiritsubo. It was but natural that the many ladies whose doors she had to pass on her repeated journeys to the emperor's room should have grown exasperated, and sometimes, when these comings and goings became frequent beyond measure, it would happen that on bridges and in corridors, here or there along the way that she must go, strange tricks were played to frighten her, or unpleasant things were left lying about, which spoiled the dresses of the ladies who accompanied her. Once, indeed, someone locked the door of a portico, so that the poor thing wandered this way and that for a great while in sore distress. So many were the miseries into which this state of affairs now daily brought her, that the emperor could no longer endure to witness her vexations, and moved her to the Koroden. In order to make room for her, he was obliged to shift the chief lady of the wardrobe to lodgings outside. So far from improving matters, he had merely procured her a new and most embittered enemy. The young prince was now 3 years old. The putting on of the trousers was performed with as much ceremony as in the case of the heir apparent. Marvelous gifts flowed from the imperial treasury and tribute house. This, too, incurred the censure of many, but brought no enmity to the child himself, for his growing beauty and the charm of his disposition were a wonder and delight to all who met him. Indeed, many persons of ripe experience confessed themselves astounded that such a creature should actually have been born in these latter and degenerate days. In the summer of that year, the lady became very downcast. She repeatedly asked for leave to go to her home, but it was not granted. For a year, she continued in the same state. The emperor, to all her entreaties, answered only, "Try for a little while longer." But she was getting worse every day, and when for 5 or 6 days she had been growing steadily weaker, her mother sent to the palace a tearful plea for her release, fearing even now that her enemies might contrive to put some unimaginable shame upon her. The sick lady left her son behind and prepared to quit the palace in secret. The emperor knew that the time had come when, little as he liked it, he must let her go. But that she should slip away without a word of farewell was more than he could bear, and he hastened to her side. He found her still charming and beautiful, but her face very thin and wan. She looked at him tenderly, saying nothing. Was she alive? So faint was the dwindling spark that she scarcely seemed so. Suddenly forgetting all that had happened and all that was to come, he called her by 100 pretty names, and weeping showered upon her 1,000 caresses. But she made no answer, for sounds and sights reached her but faintly, and she seemed dazed. As one that scarcely remembered, she lay upon a bed. Seeing her thus, he knew not what to do. In great trouble and perplexity, he sent for a hand litter, but when they would have laid her in it, he forbade them, saying, "There was an oath between us, that neither should go alone upon the road that all at last must tread. How can I now let her go from me?" The lady heard him, and "At last," she said, "though that desired at last become, because I go alone, how gladly would I live." Thus, with faint voice and failing breath, she whispered, but though she had found strength to speak, each word was uttered with great toil and pain. Come what might, the emperor would have watched by her till the end, but that the priests who were to read the intercession had already been dispatched to her home. She must be brought there before nightfall, and at last he forced himself to let the bearers carry her away. He tried to sleep, but felt stifled, and could not close his eyes. All night long, messengers were coming and going between her home and the palace. From the first, they brought no good news, and soon after midnight announced that this time on arriving at the house, they had heard a noise of wailing and lamentation, and learned from those within that the lady had just breathed her last. The emperor lay motionless, as though he had not understood. Though his father was so fond of his company, it was thought better, after this event, that the prince should go away from the palace. He did not understand what had happened, but seeing the servants all wringing their hands, and the emperor himself continually weeping, he felt that it must have been something very terrible. He knew that even quite ordinary separations made people unhappy, but here was such a dismal wailing and lamenting as he had never seen before, and he concluded that this must be some very extraordinary kind of parting. When the time came for the funeral to begin, the girl's mother cried out that the smoke of her own body would be seen rising beside the smoke of her child's bier. She rode in the same coach with the court ladies who had come to the funeral. The ceremony took place at Atago and was celebrated with great splendor. So overpowering was the mother's affection that so long as she looked on the body, she still thought of her child as alive. It was only when they lighted the pyre she suddenly realized that what lay upon it was a corpse. Then, though she tried to speak sensibly, she reeled and almost fell from the coach, and those with her turned to one another and said, "At last she knows." A herald came from the palace and read a proclamation which promoted the dead lady to the third rank. The reading of this long proclamation by the bier was a sad business. The emperor repented bitterly that he had not long ago made her a lady-in-waiting, and that was why he now raised her rank by 1 degree. There were many who grudged her even this honor, but some less stubborn began now to recall that she had indeed been a lady of uncommon beauty, and others that she had very gentle and pleasing manners, while some went so far as to say it was a shame that anybody should have disliked so sweet a lady, and that if she had not been singled out unfairly from the rest, no one would have said a word against her. The 7 weeks of mourning were, by the emperor's order, minutely observed. Time passed, but he still lived in rigid seclusion from the ladies of the court. The servants who waited upon him had a sad life, for he wept almost without ceasing both day and night. Kokiden and the other great ladies were still relentless, and went about saying it looked as though the emperor would be no less foolishly obsessed by her memory than he had been by her person. He did indeed sometimes see Kokiden's son, the firstborn prince, but this only made him long the more to see the dead lady's child, and he was always sending trusted servants, such as his own old nurse, to report to him upon the boy's progress. The time of the autumn equinox had come. Already, the touch of the evening air was cold upon the skin. So many memories crowded upon him that he sent a girl, the daughter of his quiver-bearer, with a letter to the dead lady's house. It was beautiful moonlit weather, and after he had dispatched the messenger, he lingered for a while, gazing out into the night. It was at such times as this that he had been wont to call for music. He remembered how her words, lightly whispered, had blended with those strangely fashioned harmonies, remembered how all was strange, her face, her air, her form. He thought of the poem which says that real things, in the darkness, seem no realer than dreams, and he longed for even so dim a substance as the dream life of those nights. The messenger had reached the gates of the house. She pushed them back, and a strange sight met her eyes. The old lady had for long been a widow, and the whole charge of keeping the domain in repair had fallen upon her daughter. But since her death, the mother, sunk in age and despair, had done nothing to the place, and everywhere the weeds grew high. And to all this desolation was added the wildness of the autumn gale. Great clumps of mugwort grew so thick that only the moonlight could penetrate them. The messenger alighted at the entrance of the house. At first the mother could find no words with which to greet her, but soon she said, "Alas, I have lingered too long in the world. I cannot bear to think that so fine a messenger as you have pressed your way through the dewy thickets that bar the road to my house." And she burst into uncontrollable weeping. Then the quiver-bearer's daughter said, "One of the palace maids who came here told His Majesty that her heart had been torn with pity at what she saw, and I, madam, am in like case." Then, after a little hesitation, she repeated the emperor's message. For a while, I searched in the darkness of my mind, groping for an exit from my dream. But after long pondering, I can find no way to wake. There is none here to counsel me. Will you not come to me secretly? It is not well that the young prince should spend his days in so desolate and sad a place. Let him come too. This he said, and much else, but confusedly, and with many sighs. And I, seeing that the struggle to hide his grief from me was costing him dear, hurried away from the palace without hearing all. But here is a letter that he sent. "My sight is dim," said the mother. "Let me hold his letter to the light." The letter said, "I had thought that after a while there might be some blurring, some slight effacement. But no, as days and months go by, the more senseless, the more unendurable becomes my life. I am continually thinking of the child, wondering how he fares. I had hoped that his mother and I together would watch over his upbringing. Will you not take her place in this and bring him to me as a memory of the past?" Such was the letter, and many instructions were added to it, together with a poem which said, "At the sound of the wind that binds the cold dew on Takagi Moor, my heart goes out to the tender lilac stems." It was of the young prince that he spoke in symbol, but she did not read the letter to the end. At last, the mother said, "Though I know that long life means only bitterness, I have stayed so long in the world that even before the pine tree of Takasago, I should hide my head in shame. How then should I find courage to go hither and thither in the great palace of 100 towers? Though the august summons should call me time and again, myself I could not obey. But the young prince, whether he may have heard the august wish I know not, is impatient to return, and, what is small wonder, seems very downcast in this place. Tell His Majesty this, and whatever else of my thoughts you have here learnt from me. For a little child, this house is indeed a sorry place. They say that the child is asleep." The quiver-bearer's daughter answered, "I should like to have seen him, and told the emperor how he looks. But I am awaited at the palace, and it must be late." She was hastening away, but the mother, since even those who wander in the darkness of their own black thoughts can gain by converse a momentary beam to guide their steps, I pray you sometimes to visit me of your own accord, and when you are at leisure. In years past, it was at times of joy and triumph that you came to this house, and now this is the news you bring. Foolish are they indeed who trust to fortune. From the time she was born until his death, her father, who knew his own mind, would have it that she must go to court and charge me again and again not to disappoint his wishes if he were to die. And so, though I thought that the lack of a guardian would bring her into many difficulties, I was determined to carry out his desire. At court, she found that favors only too great were to be hers, and all the while must needs endure in secrecy the tokens of inhuman malice, till hatred had heaped upon her so heavy a load of cares that she died as it were murdered. Indeed, the love that in his wisdom he deigned to show her, or so sometimes it seems to me, in the uncomprehending darkness of my heart, was crueler than indifference. So she spoke, till tears would let her speak no more, and now the night had come. All this, the girl answered, he himself has said, and, further, that thus against my will and judgment, I yielded helplessly to a passion so reckless that it caused men's eyes to blink, was perhaps decreed for the very reason that our time was fated to be so short. It was the wild and vehement passion of those who are marked down for instant separation. And though I had vowed that none should suffer because of my love, yet in the end she bore upon her shoulders the heavy hatred of many who thought that for her sake they had been wronged. So, again and again have I heard the emperor speak with tears, but now the night is far spent, and I must carry my message to the palace before day comes. So, she, weeping too, spoke as she hurried away. But the sinking moon was shining in a cloudless sky, and in the grass clumps that shivered in the cold wind, bell crickets tinkled their compelling cry. It was hard to leave these grass clumps, and the quiver bearer's daughter, loth to ride away, recited the poem which says, ceaseless as the interminable voices of the bell cricket, all night till dawn my tears flow. The mother answered, upon the thickets that teem with myriad insect voices falls the dew of a cloud dweller's tears. For the people of the court are called dwellers above the clouds. Then she gave the messenger a sash, a comb, and other things that the dead lady had left in her keeping, gifts from the emperor, which now, since their use was gone, she sent back to him as mementos of the past. The nursemaids who had come with the boy were depressed not so much at their mistress's death as at being suddenly deprived of the daily sights and sensations of the palace. They begged to go back at once, but the mother was determined not to go herself, knowing that she would cut too forlorn a figure. On the other hand, if she parted with the boy, she would be daily in great anxiety about him. That was why she did not immediately either go with him herself or send him to the palace. The quiver-bearer's daughter found the emperor still awake. He was, upon pretext of visiting the flower pots in front of the palace, which were then in full bloom, waiting for her out of doors, while 4 or 5 trusted ladies conversed with him. At this time, it was his wont to examine morning and evening a picture of the everlasting wrong. The text written by Teiji no In, with poems by Issei and Tsurayuki, both in Yamato speech and in that of the men beyond the sea. And the story of this poem was the common matter of his talk. Now, he turned to the messenger and asked eagerly for all her news, and when she had given him a secret and faithful account of the sad place whence she had come, she handed him the mother's letter. His Majesty's gracious commands, I read with reverence deeper than I can express, but their purport has brought great darkness and confusion to my mind. All this, together with a poem in which she compared her grandchild to a flower which has lost the tree that sheltered it from the great winds was so wild and so ill-writ, as only to be suffered from the hand of one whose sorrow was as yet unhealed. Again, the emperor strove for self-possession in the presence of his messenger, but as he pictured to himself the time when the dead lady first came to him, 1,000 memories pressed thick about him, and recollection linked to recollection carried him onward, till he shuddered to think how utterly unmarked, unheeded all these hours and days had fled. At last he said, I too thought much, and with delight, how with most profit might be fulfilled the wish that her father the counselor left behind him. But of that no more. If the young prince lives, occasion may yet be found. It is for his long life that we must pray. He looked at the presents she had brought back, and would that like the wizard you had brought a kingfisher hairpin as token of your visit to the place where her spirit dwells, he cried, and recited the poem, Oh, for a master of magic, who might go and seek her, and by a message teach me where her spirit dwells. For the picture of Kwei Fei, skillful though the painter might be, was but the work of a brush, and had no living fragrance. And though the poet tells us that Kwei Fei's grace was as that of the hibiscus of the royal lake, or the willows of the Wei Yang Palace, the lady in the picture was all paint and powder, and had a simpering Chinesified air. But when he thought of the lost lady's voice and form, he could find neither in the beauty of flowers nor in the song of birds any fit comparison. Continually he pined that fate should not have allowed them to fulfill the vow which morning and evening was ever talked of between them, the vow that their lives should be as the twin birds that share a wing, the twin trees that share a bough. The rustling of the wind, the chirping of an insect would cast him into the deepest melancholy. And now Kokiden, who for a long while had not been admitted to his chamber, must needs sit in the moonlight, making music far on into the night. This evidently distressed him in the highest degree. And those ladies and courtiers who were with him were equally shocked and distressed on his behalf. But the offending lady was one who stood much upon her dignity, and she was determined to behave as though nothing of any consequence had taken place in the palace. And now the moon had set. The emperor thought of the girl's mother in the house amid the thickets, and wondered, making a poem of the thought, with what feelings she had watched the sinking of the autumn moon. For even we, men above the clouds, were weeping when it sank. He raised the torches high in their sockets, and still sat up, but at last he heard voices coming from the watch-house of the right, and knew that the hour of the bull had struck. Then, lest he should be seen, he went into his chamber. He found he could not sleep, and was up before daybreak. But, as though he remembered the words, he knew not the dawn was at his window, of Isa's poem, he showed little attention to the affairs of his morning audience, scarcely touched his dried rice, and seemed but dimly aware of the viands on the great table, so that the carvers and waiting men groaned to see their master's plight. And all his servants, both men and women, kept on whispering to one another, what a senseless occupation has ours become, and supposed that he was obeying some extravagant vow. Regardless of his subjects' murmurings, he continually allowed his mind to wander from their affairs to his own, so that the scandal of his negligence was now as dangerous to the state as it had been before. And again, there began to be whispered references to a certain emperor of another land. Thus, the months and days passed, and in the end, the young prince arrived at court. He had grown up to be a child of unrivaled beauty, and the emperor was delighted with him. In the spring, an heir to the throne was to be proclaimed, and the emperor was sorely tempted to pass over the firstborn prince in favor of the young child. But there was no one at court to support such a choice, and it was unlikely that it would be tolerated by the people. It would indeed bring danger rather than glory to the child. So he carefully concealed from the world that he had any such design, and gained great credit, men saying, "Though he dotes on the boy, there is at least some limit to his folly." And even the great ladies of the palace became a little easier in their minds. The grandmother remained inconsolable and impatient to set out upon her search for the place where the dead lady's spirit dwelt. She soon expired. Again, the emperor was in great distress, and this time the boy, being now 6 years old, understood what had happened and wept bitterly, and often he spoke sadly of what he had seen when he was brought to visit the poor dead lady who had for many years been so kind to him. Henceforward, he lived always at the palace. When he became 7, he began to learn his letters, and his quickness was so unusual that his father was amazed, thinking that now no one would have the heart to be unkind to the child. The emperor began to take him to the apartments of Kokiden and the rest, saying to them, "Now that his mother is dead, I know that you will be nice to him." Thus, the boy began to penetrate the royal curtain. The roughest soldier, the bitterest foeman, could not have looked on such a child without a smile, and Kokiden did not send him away. She had 2 daughters who were indeed not such fine children as the little prince. He also played with the court ladies, who, because he was now very pretty and bashful in his ways, found endless amusement, as indeed did everyone else, in sharing his games. As for his serious studies, he soon learnt to send the sounds of zithern and flute flying gaily to the clouds. But if I were to tell you of all his accomplishments, you would think that he was soon going to become a bore. At this time, some Koreans came to court, and among them a fortune teller. Hearing this, the emperor did not send for them to come to the palace because of the law against the admission of foreigners, which was made by the Emperor Uda. But in strict secrecy, he sent the prince to the stranger's quarters. He went under the escort of the Secretary of the Right, who was to introduce him as his own son. The fortune teller was astonished by the boy's lineaments and expressed his surprise by continually nodding his head. "He has the marks of one who might become a father of the state, and if this were his fate, he would not stop short at any lesser degree than that of mighty king and emperor of all the land. But when I look again, I see that confusion and sorrow would attend his reign. But should he become a great officer of state and counselor of the realm, I see no happy issue, for he would be defying those kingly signs of which I spoke before." The secretary was a most talented, wise, and learned scholar, and now began to conduct an interesting conversation with the fortune teller. They exchanged essays and poems, and the fortune teller made a little speech saying, "It has been a great pleasure to me, on the eve of my departure, to meet with a man of capacities so unusual, and though I regret my departure, I shall now take away most agreeable impressions of my visit." The little prince presented him with a very nice verse of poetry, at which he expressed boundless admiration, and offered the boy a number of handsome presents. In return, the emperor sent him a large reward from the imperial treasury. This was all kept strictly secret, but somehow or other, the heir apparent's grandfather, the minister of the right, and others of his party got wind of it and became very suspicious. The emperor then sent for native fortune tellers and made trial of them, explaining that because of certain signs which he had himself observed, he had hitherto refrained from making the boy a prince. With one accord, they agreed that he had acted with great prudence, and the emperor determined not to set the child adrift upon the world as a prince without royal standing or influence upon the mother's side. For he thought, "My own power is very insecure. I had best set him to watch on my behalf over the great officers of state." Thinking that he had thus agreeably settled the child's future, he set seriously to work upon his education and saw to it that he should be made perfect in every branch of art and knowledge. He showed such aptitude in all his studies that it seemed a pity he should remain a commoner, and as it had been decided that it would arouse suspicion if he were made a prince, the emperor consulted with certain doctors, wise in the lore of the planets and phases of the moon, and they, with one accord, recommended that he should be made a member of the Minamoto or Gen clan. So this was done. As the years went by, the emperor did not forget his lost lady, and though many women were brought to the palace in the hope that he might take pleasure in them, he turned from them all, believing that there was not in the world anyone like her whom he had lost. There was at that time a lady whose beauty was of great repute. She was the fourth daughter of the previous emperor, and it was said that her mother, the Dowager Empress, had brought her up with unrivaled care. A certain dame of the household, who had served the former emperor, was intimately acquainted with the young princess, having known her since childhood, and still having occasion to observe her from without. "I have served in 3 courts," said the dame, "and in all that time have seen none who could be likened to the departed lady, save the daughter of the empress mother. She indeed is a lady of rare beauty." So she spoke to the emperor, and he, much wondering what truth there was in it, listened with great attention. The empress mother heard of this with great alarm, for she remembered with what open cruelty the sinister Lady Kokiden had treated her former rival, and though she did not dare speak openly of her fears, she was managing to delay the girl's presentation, when suddenly she died. The emperor, hearing that the bereaved princess was in a very desolate condition, sent word gently telling her that he should henceforward look upon her as though she were one of the lady princesses his daughters, her servants and guardians, and her brother, Prince Hyobukyo, thought that life in the palace might distract her, and would at least be better than the gloomy desolation of her home, and so they sent her to the court. She lived in apartments called Fujitsubo, Wistaria Tub, and was known by this name. The emperor could not deny that she bore an astonishing resemblance to his beloved. She was, however, of much higher rank, so that everyone was anxious to please her, and whatever happened, they were prepared to grant her the utmost license, whereas the dead lady had been imperiled by the emperor's favor only because the court was not willing to accept her. His old love did not now grow dimmer, and though he sometimes found solace and distraction in shifting his thoughts from the lady who had died to the lady who was so much like her, yet life remained for him a sad business. Genji, he of the Minamoto clan, as he was now called, was constantly at the emperor's side. He was soon quite at his ease with the common run of ladies-in-waiting and ladies of the wardrobe. so it was not likely he would be shy with one who was daily summoned to the emperor's apartments. It was but natural that all these ladies should vie eagerly with one another for the first place in Genji's affections, and there were many whom, in various ways, he admired very much, but most of them behaved in too grown-up a fashion. Only one, the new princess, was pretty and quite young as well, and though she tried to hide from him, it was inevitable that they should often meet. He could not remember his mother, but the dame of the household had told him how very like to her the girl was, and this interested his childish fancy, and he would like to have been her great friend and lived with her always. One day, the emperor said to her, "Do not be unkind to him. He is interested because he has heard that you are so like his mother. Do not think him impertinent, but behave nicely to him. You are indeed so like him in look and features that you might well be his mother." And so, young though he was, fleeting beauty took its hold upon his thoughts. He felt his first clear predilection. Kokiden had never loved this lady too well, and now her old enmity to Genji sprang up again. Her own children were reckoned to be of quite uncommon beauty, but in this they were no match for Genji, who was so lovely a boy that people called him Hikaru Genji, or Genji the Shining One, and Princess Fujitsubo, who also had many admirers, was called Princess Glittering Sunshine, though it seemed a shame to put so lovely a child into man's dress. He was now 12 years old, and the time for his initiation was come. The emperor directed the preparations with tireless zeal, and insisted upon a magnificence beyond what was prescribed. The initiation of the heir apparent, which had last year been celebrated in the Southern Hall, was not a whit more splendid in its preparations. The ordering of the banquets that were to be given in various quarters, and the work of the treasurer and grain intendant he supervised in person, fearing lest the officials should be remiss, and in the end all was perfection. The ceremony took place in the eastern wing of the emperor's own apartments, and the throne was placed facing towards the east, with the seats of the initiate to be and his sponsor, the minister of the left, in front. Genji arrived at the hour of the monkey. He looked very handsome, with his long childish locks, and the sponsor, whose duty it had just been to bind them with the purple fillet, was sorry to think that all this would soon be changed, and even the clerk of the treasury seemed loath to sever those lovely tresses with the ritual knife. The emperor, as he watched, remembered for a moment what pride the mother would have taken in the ceremony, but soon drove the weak thought from his mind. Duly crowned, Genji went to his chamber, and changing into man's dress, went down into the courtyard and performed the dance of homage, which he did with such grace that tears stood in every eye. And now the emperor, whose grief had of late grown somewhat less insistent, was again overwhelmed by memories of the past. It had been feared that his delicate features would show to less advantage when he had put aside his childish dress, but on the contrary, he looked handsomer than ever. His sponsor, the minister of the left, had an only daughter whose beauty the heir apparent had noticed, but now the father began to think he would not encourage that match, but would offer her to Genji. He sounded the emperor upon this, and found that he would be very glad to obtain for the boy the advantage of so powerful a connection. When the courtiers assembled to drink the love cup, Genji came and took his place among the other princes. The minister of the left came up and whispered something in his ear, but the boy blushed and could think of no reply. A chamberlain now came over to the minister and brought him a summons to wait upon his majesty immediately. When he arrived before the throne, a lady of the wardrobe handed to him the great white inner garment and the maid's skirt, which were his ritual due as sponsor to the prince. Then, when he had made him drink out of the royal cup, the emperor recited a poem in which he prayed that the binding of the purple fillet might symbolize the union of their two houses, and the minister answered him that nothing should sever this union save the fading of the purple band. Then he descended the long stairs, and from the courtyard performed the grand obeisance. Here, too, were shown the horses from the royal stables and the hawks from the royal falconry that had been decreed as presents for Genji. At the foot of the stairs, the princes and courtiers were lined up to receive their bounties, and gifts of every kind were showered upon them. That day, the hampers and fruit baskets were distributed in accordance with the emperor's directions by the learned secretary of the right, and boxes of cake and presents lay about so thick that one could scarcely move. Such profusion had not been seen even at the heir apparent's initiation. That night, Genji went to the minister's house, where his betrothal was celebrated with great splendor. It was thought that the little prince looked somewhat childish and delicate, but his beauty astonished everyone. Only the bride, who was 4 years older, regarded him as a mere baby and was rather ashamed of him. The emperor still demanded Genji's attendance at the palace, so he did not set up a house of his own. In his inmost heart, he was always thinking how much nicer she was than anyone else, and only wanted to be with people who were like her. But alas, no one was the least like her. Everyone seemed to make a great deal of fuss about Princess Arois, his betrothed, but he could see nothing nice about her. The girl at the palace now filled all his childish thoughts, and this obsession became a misery to him. Now that he was a man, he could no longer frequent the women's quarters, as he had been wont to do, but sometimes, when an entertainment was afoot, he found comfort in hearing her voice, dimly blending with the sound of zithern or flute, and felt his grown-up existence to be unendurable. After an absence of 5 or 6 days, he would occasionally spend 2 or 3 at his betrothed's house, his father-in-law, attributing this negligence to his extreme youth, was not at all perturbed, and always received him warmly. Whenever he came, the most interesting and agreeable of the young people of the day were asked to meet him, and endless trouble was taken in arranging games to amuse him. The shigesa, one of the rooms which had belonged to his mother, was allotted to him as his official quarters in the palace, and the servants who had waited on her were now gathered together again and formed his suite. His grandmother's house was falling into decay. The Imperial Office of Works was ordered to repair it. The grouping of the trees and disposition of the surrounding hills had always made the place delightful. Now, the basin of the lake was widened, and many other improvements were carried out. If only I were going to live here with someone whom I liked, thought Genji sadly. Some say that the name of Hikaru, the Shining One, was given to him in admiration by the Korean fortune-teller. Genji the Shining One. He knew that the bearer of such a name could not escape much scrutiny and jealous censure, and that his lightest dallyings would be proclaimed to posterity. Fearing, then, lest he should appear to after ages as a mere good-for-nothing and trifler, and knowing that so accursed is the blabbing of gossips' tongues, his most secret acts might come to light, he was obliged always to act with great prudence and to preserve at least the outward appearance of respectability. Thus, nothing really romantic ever happened to him, and Kitano no Shosho would have scoffed at his story. While he was still a captain of the guard and was spending most of his time at the palace, his infrequent visits to the Great Hall were taken as a sign that some secret passion had made its imprint on his heart. But in reality, the frivolous, commonplace, straight-ahead amours of his companions did not in the least interest him, and it was a curious trait in his character that when on rare occasions, despite all resistance, love did gain a hold upon him, it was always in the most improbable and hopeless entanglement that he became involved. It was the season of the long rains. For many days there had not been a fine moment, and the court was keeping a strict fast. The people at the Great Hall were becoming very impatient of Genji's long residence at the palace, but the young lords, who were court pages, liked waiting upon Genji better than upon anyone else, always managing to put out his clothes and decorations in some marvelous new way. Among these brothers, his greatest friend was the equerry, Tuno Chujo, with whom above all other companions of his playtime, he found himself familiar and at ease. This lord, too, found the house which his father-in-law, the minister of the right, had been at pains to build for him somewhat oppressive, while at his father's house he, like Genji, found the splendors somewhat dazzling, so that he ended by becoming Genji's constant companion at court. They shared both studies and play, and were inseparable companions on every sort of occasion, so that soon all formalities were dispensed with between them, and the inmost secrets of their hearts freely exchanged. It was on a night when the rain never ceased its dismal downpour. There were not many people about in the palace, and Genji's rooms seemed even quieter than usual. He was sitting by the lamp, looking at various books and papers. Suddenly, he began pulling some letters out of the drawers of a desk which stood nearby. This aroused to no Chujo's curiosity. "Some of them I can show to you," said Genji, "but there are others which I had rather. It is just those which I want to see. Ordinary, commonplace letters are very much alike, and I do not suppose that yours differ much from mine. What I want to see are passionate letters written in moments of resentment, letters hinting consent, letters written at dusk." He begged so eagerly that Genji let him examine the drawers. It was not indeed likely that he had put any very important or secret documents in the ordinary desk. He would have hidden them away much further from sight, so he felt sure that the letters in these drawers would be nothing to worry about. After turning over a few of them, "What an astonishing variety!" Tuno Chujo exclaimed, and began guessing at the writers' names, and made one or two good hits. More often he was wrong, and Genji, amused by his puzzled air, said very little, but generally managed to lead him astray. At last he took the letters back, saying, "But you too must have a large collection. Show me some of yours, and my desk will open to you with better will." "I have none that you would care to see," said Tuno Chujo, and he continued, "I have at last discovered that there exists no woman of whom one can say, 'Here is perfection.' This is indeed she. There are many who have the superficial art of writing a good running hand, or if occasion requires, of making a quick repartee, but there are few who will stand the ordeal of any further test. Usually, their minds are entirely occupied by admiration for their own accomplishments, and their abuse of all rivals creates a most unpleasant impression. Some again are adored by over-fond parents. These have been since childhood guarded behind lattice windows, and no knowledge of them is allowed to reach the outer world, save that of their excellence in some accomplishment or art. And this may indeed sometimes arouse our interest. She is pretty and graceful, and has not yet mixed at all with the world. Such a girl, by closely copying some model and applying herself with great industry, will often succeed in really mastering one of the minor and ephemeral arts. Her friends are careful to say nothing of her defects and to exaggerate her accomplishments, and while we cannot altogether trust their praise, we cannot believe that their judgment is entirely astray. But when we take steps to test their statements, we are invariably disappointed. He paused, seeming to be slightly ashamed of the cynical tone which he had adopted, and added, "I know my experience is not large, but that is the conclusion I have come to so far." Then Genji, smiling, "And are there any who lack even one accomplishment?" "No doubt, but in such a case, it is unlikely that anyone would be successfully decoyed. The number of those who have nothing to recommend them, and of those in whom nothing but good can be found, is probably equal. I divide women into 3 classes. Those of high rank and birth are made such a fuss of, and their weak points are so completely concealed, that we are certain to be told that they are paragons. About those of the middle class, everyone is allowed to express his own opinion, and we shall have much conflicting evidence to sift. As for the lower classes, they do not concern us. The completeness with which To no Chujo disposed of the question amused Genji, who said, "It will not always be so easy to know into which of the 3 classes a woman ought to be put. For sometimes people of high rank sink to the most abject positions, while others of common birth rise to be high officers, wear self-important faces, redecorate the inside of their houses, and think themselves as good as anyone. How are we to deal with such cases?" At this moment, they were joined by Hidori, no Uma, no Kami, and Toshikibu, no Jo, who said they had also come to the palace to keep the fast. As both of them were great lovers and good talkers, To no Chujo handed over to them the decision of Genji's question, and in the discussion which followed, many unflattering things were said. Uma no Kami spoke first. "However high a lady may rise, if she does not come of an adequate stock, the world will think very differently of her from what it would of one born to such honors. But if through adverse fortune a lady of highest rank finds herself in friendless misery, the noble breeding of her mind is soon forgotten, and she becomes an object of contempt. I think then that, taking all things into account, we must put such ladies too into the middle class. But when we come to classify the daughters of Zurio, who are sent to labor at the affairs of distant provinces, they have such ups and downs that we may reasonably put them too into the middle class. Then there are ministers of the 3rd and 4th classes without cabinet rank. These are generally thought less of even than the humdrum, ordinary officials. They are usually of quite good birth, but have much less responsibility than ministers of state, and consequently much greater peace of mind. Girls born into such households are brought up in complete security from want or deprivation of any kind, and indeed often amid surroundings of the utmost luxury and splendor. Many of them grow up into women whom it would be folly to despise. Some have been admitted at court, where they have enjoyed a quite unexpected success, and of this I could cite many, many instances. Their success has generally been due to their having a lot of money said Genji, smiling. You should have known better than to say that, said to no Chujo, reproving him. And Uma no Kami went on. There are some whose lineage and reputation are so high that it never occurs to one that their education could possibly be at fault. Yet when we meet them, we find ourselves exclaiming in despair, how can they have contrived to grow up like this? No doubt the perfect woman, in whom none of those essentials is lacking, must somewhere exist, and it would not startle me to find her. But she would certainly be beyond the reach of a humble person like myself, and for that reason, I should like to put her in a category of her own, and not to count her in our present classification. But suppose that behind some gateway overgrown with vineweed, in a place where no one knows there is a house at all, there should be locked away some creature of unimagined beauty. With what excitement should we discover her? The complete surprise of it, the upsetting of all our wise theories and classifications, would be likely, I think, to lay a strange and sudden enchantment upon us. I imagine her father rather large and gruff, her brother a surly, ill-looking fellow, locked away in an utterly blank and uninteresting bedroom. She will be subject to odd flights of fancy, so that in her hands the arts that others learn as trivial accomplishments will seem strangely full of meaning and importance. Or perhaps in some particular art she will thrill us by her delightful and unexpected mastery. Such a one may perhaps be beneath the attention of those of you who are of flawless lineage. But for my part, I find it hard to banish her. And here he looked at Shikibu no Jo, who wondered whether the description had been meant to apply to his own sisters, but said nothing. If it is difficult to choose even out of the top class, thought Genji, and began to doze. He was dressed in a suit of soft white silk, with a rough cloak carelessly slung over his shoulders, with belt and fastenings untied. In the light of the lamp against which he was leaning, he looked so lovely that one might have wished he were a girl, and they thought that even Uma no Kami's perfect woman, whom he had placed in a category of her own, would not be worthy of such a prince as Genji. The conversation went on. Many persons and things were discussed. Uma no Kami contended that perfection is equally difficult to find in other spheres. The sovereign is hard put to it to choose his ministers. But he at least has an easier task than the husband, for he does not entrust the affairs of his kingdom to 1, 2, or 3 persons alone, but sets up a whole system of superiors and subordinates. But when the mistress of a house is to be selected, a single individual must be found who will combine in her person many diverse qualities. It will not do to be too exacting. Let us be sure that the lady of our choice possesses certain tangible qualities which we admire, and if in other ways she falls short of our ideal, we must be patient and call to mind those qualities which first induced us to begin our courting. But even here we must beware, for there are some who, in the selfishness of youth and flawless beauty, are determined that not a dust flick shall fall upon them. In their letters they choose the most harmless topics, but yet contrive to color the very texture of the written signs with a tenderness that vaguely disquiets us. But such a one, when we have at last secured a meeting, will speak so low that she can scarcely be heard, and the few faint sentences that she murmurs beneath her breath serve only to make her more mysterious than before. All this may seem to be the pretty shrinking of girlish modesty, but we may later find that what held her back was the very violence of her passions. Or again, where all seems plain sailing, the perfect companion will turn out to be too impressionable and will, upon the most inappropriate occasions, display her affections in so ludicrous a way that we begin to wish ourselves rid of her. Then there is the zealous housewife who, regardless of her appearance, twists her hair behind her ears and devotes herself entirely to the details of our domestic welfare. The husband, in his comings and goings about the world, is certain to see and hear many things which he cannot discuss with strangers, but would gladly talk over with an intimate who could listen with sympathy and understanding, someone who could laugh with him or weep if need be. It often happens, too, that some political event will greatly perturb or amuse him, and he sits apart longing to tell someone about it. He suddenly laughs at some secret recollection or sighs audibly, but the wife only says lightly, "What is the matter?" and shows no interest. This is apt to be very trying. No. Kami considered several other cases, but he reached no definite conclusion, and sighing deeply, he continued, "We will then, as I have suggested, let birth and beauty go by the board. Let her be the simplest and most guileless of creatures, so long as she is honest and of a peaceable disposition, that in the end we may not lack a place of trust, and if some other virtue chances to be hers, we shall treasure it as a godsend. But if we discover in her some small defect, it shall not be too closely scrutinized, and we may be sure that if she is strong in the virtues of tolerance and amiability, her outward appearance will not be beyond measure harsh. There are those who carry forbearance too far, and affecting not to notice wrongs which cry out for redress, seem to be paragons of misused fidelity. But suddenly, a time comes when such a one can restrain herself no longer, and leaving behind her a poem couched in pitiful language and calculated to rouse the most painful sentiments of remorse, she flies to some remote village in the mountains or some desolate seashore, and for a long while all trace of her is lost. When I was a boy, the ladies in waiting used to tell me sad tales of this kind. I never doubted that the sentiments expressed in them were real, and I wept profusely. But now I am beginning to suspect that such sorrows are for the most part affectation. She has left behind her, this lady whom we are imagining, a husband who is probably still fond of her. She is making herself very unhappy, and by disappearing in this way is causing him unspeakable anxiety, perhaps only for the ridiculous purpose of putting his affection to the test. Then comes along some admiring friend crying, "What a heart! What depth of feeling!" She becomes more lugubrious than ever, and finally enters a nunnery. When she decided on this step, she was perfectly sincere and had not the slightest intention of ever returning to the world. Then some female friend hears of it, and poor thing, she cries, "In what an agony of mind must she have been to do this?" and visits her in her cell, when the husband, who has never ceased to mourn for her, hears what she has become. He bursts into tears, and some servant or old nurse, seeing this, bustles off to the nunnery, with tales of the husband's despair, and, "Oh, madam, what a shame, what a shame." Then the nun, forgetting where and what she is, raises her hand to her head to straighten her hair, and finds that it has been shorn away. In helpless misery, she sinks to the floor, and do what she will, the tears begin to flow. Now all is lost, for since she cannot at every moment be praying for strength, there creeps into her mind the sinful thought that she did ill to become a nun, and so often does she commit this sin that even Buddha must think her wickeder now than she was before she took her vows, and she feels certain that these terrible thoughts are leading her soul to the blackest hell. But if the karma of their past lives should chance to be strongly weighted against a parting, she will be found and captured before she has taken her final vows. In such a case, their life will be beyond endurance, unless she be fully determined, come good or ill, this time to close her eyes to all that goes amiss. Again, there are others who must needs be forever mounting guard over their own and their husband's affections. Such a one, if she sees in him not a fault indeed, but even the slightest inclination to stray, makes a foolish scene, declaring with indignation that she will have no more to do with him. But even if a man's fancy should chance indeed to have gone somewhat astray, yet his earlier affection may still be strong, and in the end will return to its old haunts. Now, by her tantrums, she has made a rift that cannot be joined, whereas she who, when some small wrong calls for a silent rebuke, shows by a glance that she is not unaware, but when some large offense demands admonishment, knows how to hint without severity, will end by standing in her master's affections better than ever she stood before. For often the sight of our own forbearance will give our neighbor strength to rule his mutinous affections. But she whose tolerance and forgiveness know no bounds, though this may seem to proceed from the beauty and amiability of her disposition, is in fact displaying the shallowness of her feeling. The unmoored boat must needs drift with the stream. Are you not of this mind? To no Chujo nodded. Some, he said, have imagined that by arousing a baseless suspicion in the mind of the beloved, we can revive a waning devotion. But this experiment is very dangerous. Those who recommend it are confident that so long as resentment is groundless, one need only suffer it in silence, and all will soon be well. I have observed, however, that this is by no means the case. But when all is said and done, there can be no greater virtue in woman than this, that she should, with gentleness and forbearance, meet every wrong whatsoever that falls to her share. He thought as he said this of his own sister, Princess Aoi, but was disappointed and piqued to discover that Genji, whose comments he awaited, was fast asleep. Uma no Kami was an expert in such discussions, and now stood preening his feathers. Tu no Chujo was disposed to hear what more he had to say, and was now at pains to humor and encourage him. It is with women, said Uma no Kami, as it is with the works of craftsmen. The woodcarver can fashion whatever he will, yet his products are but toys of the moment, to be glanced at in jest, not fashioned according to any precept or law. When times change, the carver too will change his style, and make new trifles to hit the fancy of the passing day. But there is another kind of artist, who sets more soberly about his work, striving to give real beauty to the things which men actually use, and to give to them the shapes which tradition has ordained. This maker of real things must not for a moment be confused with the carver of idle toys. In the painter's workshop, too, there are many excellent artists chosen for their proficiency in ink drawing. And indeed, they are all so clever, it is hard to set one above the other, but all of them are at work on subjects intended to impress and surprise. One paints the mountain of Horai, another a raging sea monster riding a storm, another ferocious animals from the land beyond the sea, or faces of imaginary demons, letting their fancy run wildly riot. They have no thought of beauty, but only of how best they may astonish the beholder's eye. And though nothing in their pictures is real, all is probable. But ordinary hills and rivers, just as they are, houses, such as you may see anywhere, with all their real beauty and harmony of form, quietly to draw such scenes as this, or to show what lies behind some intimate hedge that is folded away far from the world, and thick trees upon some unheroic hill, and all this with befitting care for composition, proportion, and the like. Such works demand the highest master's utmost skill, and must needs draw the common craftsman into 1,000 blunders. So too in handwriting, we see some who aimlessly prolong their cursive strokes this way or that, and hope their flourishes will be mistaken for genius. But true penmanship preserves in every letter its balance and form, and though at first some letters may seem but half-formed, yet when we compare them with the copybooks, we find that there is nothing at all amiss. So it is in these trifling matters. And how much, the more in judging of the human heart, should we distrust all fashionable airs and graces, all tricks and smartness, learnt only to please the outward gaze. This I first understood some while ago, and if you will have patience with me, I will tell you the story. So saying, he came and sat a little closer to them, and Genji woke up. To no Chujo, in rapt attention, was sitting with his cheek propped upon his hand. Uma no Kami's whole speech that night was indeed very much like a chaplain's sermon about the ways of the world, and was rather absurd. But upon such occasions as this, we are easily led on into discussing our own ideas and most private secrets without the least reserve. It happened when I was young, and in an even more humble position than I am today. Uma no Kami continued. I was in love with a girl who, like the drudging, faithful wife of whom I spoke a little while ago, was not a full-sail beauty, and I, in my youthful vanity, thought she was all very well for the moment, but would never do for the wife of so fine a fellow as I. She made an excellent companion in times when I was at a loose end, but she was of a disposition so violently jealous that I could have put up with a little less devotion if only she had been somewhat less fiercely ardent and exacting. Thus, I kept thinking, vexed by her unrelenting suspicions. But then I would remember her ceaseless devotion to the interests of one who was after all a person of no account, and full of remorse, I made sure that with a little patience on my part, she would one day learn to school her jealousy. It was her habit to minister to my smallest wants even before I was myself aware of them. Whatever she felt was lacking in her, she strove to acquire, and where she knew that in some quality of mind she still fell behind my desires, she was at pains never to show her deficiency in such a way as might vex me. Thus, in one way or another, she was always busy in forwarding my affairs, and she hoped that if all down to the last dewdrop, as they say, were conducted as I should wish, this would be set down to her credit, and help to balance the defects in her person, which meek and obliging as she might be, could not, she fondly imagined, fail to offend me. And at this time she even hid herself from strangers, lest their poor opinion of her looks should put me out of countenance. I meanwhile, becoming used to her homely looks, was well content with her character, save for this one article of jealousy, And here she showed no amendment. Then I began to think to myself, surely, since she seems so anxious to please, so timid, there must be some way of giving her a fright, which will teach her a lesson, so that for a while at least, we may have a respite from this accursed business. And though I knew it would cost me dear, I determined to make a pretense of giving her up, thinking that since she was so fond of me, this would be the best way to teach her a lesson. Accordingly, I behaved with the greatest coldness to her, and she, as usual, began her jealous fit, and behaved with such folly that in the end I said to her, if you want to be rid forever of one who loves you dearly, you are going the right way about it, by all these endless poutings over nothing at all. But if you want to go on with me, you must give up suspecting some deep intrigue each time you fancy that I am treating you unkindly. Do this, and you may be sure I shall continue to love you dearly. It may well be that as time goes on, I shall rise a little higher in the world, and then I thought I had managed matters very cleverly, though perhaps in the heat of the moment I might have spoken somewhat too roughly. She smiled faintly and answered that if it were only a matter of bearing for a while with my failures and disappointments, that did not trouble her at all, and she would gladly wait till I became a person of consequence. But it is a hard task, she said, to go on year after year enduring your coldness and waiting the time when you will at last learn to behave to me with some decency. And therefore, I agree with you that the time has come when we had better go each his own way. Then, in a fit of wild and uncontrollable jealousy, she began to pour upon me a torrent of bitter reproaches, and with a woman's savagery, she suddenly seized my little finger and bit deep into it. The unexpected pain was difficult to bear, but composing myself, I said tragically, now you have put this mark upon me, I shall get on worse than ever in polite society. As for promotion, I shall be considered a disgrace to the meanest public office and unable to cut a genteel figure in any capacity. I shall be obliged to withdraw myself completely from the world. You and I, at any rate, shall certainly not meet again. And bending my injured finger, as I turned to go, I recited the verse, as on bent hand, I count the times that we have met. It is not one finger only that bears witness to my pain. And she, all of a sudden, bursting into tears, if still in your heart only you look for pains to count, then were our hands best employed in parting. After a few more words, I left her, not for a moment, thinking that all was over. Days went by, and no news. I began to be restless. One night, when I had been at the palace for the rehearsal of the festival music, heavy sleet was falling, and I stood at the spot where those of us who came from the palace had dispersed, unable to make up my mind which way to go, for in no direction had I anything which could properly be called a home. I might, of course, take a room in the palace precincts, but I shivered to think of the cheerless grandeur that would surround me. Suddenly, I began to wonder what she was thinking, how she was looking, and brushing the snow off my shoulders, I set out for her house. I own I felt uneasy, but I thought that after so long a time, her anger must surely have somewhat abated. Inside the room, a lamp showed dimly, turned to the wall. Some undergarments were hung out upon a large, warmly quilted couch. The bed hangings were drawn up, and I made sure that she was, for some reason, actually expecting me. I was priding myself on having made so lucky a hit, when suddenly, not at home, and on questioning the maid, I learnt that she had but that very night gone to her parents' home, leaving only a few necessary servants behind. The fact that she had till now sent no poem or conciliatory message seemed to show some hardening of heart and had already disquieted me. Now, I began to fear that her accursed suspiciousness and jealousy had but been a stratagem to make me grow weary of her. And though I could recall no further proof of this, I fell into great despair, and to show her that, though we no longer met, I still thought of her and planned for her, I got her some stuff for a dress, choosing a most delightful and unusual shade of color, and a material that I knew she would be glad to have. For after all, I thought, she cannot want to put me altogether out of her head. When I informed her of this purchase, she did not rebuff me, nor make any attempt to hide from me, but to all my questions, she answered quietly and composedly, without any sign that she was ashamed of herself. At last, she told me that if I went on as before, she could never forgive me, but if I would promise to live more quietly, she would take me back again. Seeing that she still hankered after me, I determined to school her a little further yet, and said that I could make no conditions and must be free to live as I chose. So the tug of war went on, but it seems that it hurt her far more than I knew, for in a little while she fell into a decline and died, leaving me aghast at the upshot of my wanton game. And now I felt that, whatever faults she might have had, her devotion alone would have made her a fit wife for me. I remembered how both in trivial talk and in consideration of important matters, she had never once shown herself at a loss. How, in the dyeing of brocades, she rivaled the goddess of Tatsuda, who tints the autumn leaves, and how in needlework and the like, she was not less skillful than Tanabeta, the weaving lady of the sky. Here he stopped, greatly distressed at the recollection of the lady's many talents and virtues. The weaving lady and the herd boy said, "To know Chujo, enjoy a love that is eternal." Had she but resembled the divine sempstress in this, you would not, I think, have minded her being a little less skillful with her needle. I wonder that with this rare creature in mind, you pronounce the world to be so blank a place. Listen, replied Uma no Kami. About the same time there was another lady whom I used to visit. She was of higher birth than the first. Her skill in poetry, cursive writing, and lute playing, her readiness of hand and tongue were all marked enough to show that she was not a woman of trivial nature, and this indeed was allowed by those who knew her. To add to this, she was not ill-looking, and sometimes, when I needed a rest from my unhappy persecutress, I used to visit her secretly. In the end, I found that I had fallen completely in love with her. After the death of the other, I was in great distress, but it was no use brooding over the past, and I began to visit my new lady more and more often. I soon came to the conclusion that she was frivolous, and I had no confidence that I should have liked what went on when I was not there to see. I now visited her only at long intervals, and at last decided that she had another lover. It was during the godless month, on a beautiful moonlight night. As I was leaving the palace, I met a certain young courtier who, when I told him that I was driving out to spend the night at the Danagans, said that my way was his and joined me. The road passed my lady's house, and here it was that he alighted, saying that he had an engagement which he should have been very sorry not to fulfill. The wall was half in ruins, and through its gaps I saw the shadowy waters of the lake. It would not have been easy for even the moonbeams seemed to loiter here, to hasten past so lovely a place. And when he left his coach, I too left mine. At once this man, whom I now knew to be that other lover whose existence I had guessed, went and sat unconcernedly on the bamboo skirting of the portico and began to gaze at the moon. The chrysanthemums were just in full bloom. The bright fallen leaves were tumbling and tussling in the wind. It was indeed a scene of wonderful beauty that met our eyes. Presently, he took a flute out of the folds of his dress and began to play upon it. Then, putting the flute aside, he began to murmur, "Sweet is the shade," and other catches. Soon, a pleasant-sounding native zithern began to tune up somewhere within the house, and an ingenious accompaniment was fitted to his careless warblings. Her zithern was tuned to the autumn mode, and she played with so much tenderness and feeling that though the music came from behind closed shutters, it sounded quite modern and passionate, and well accorded with the soft beauty of the moonlight. The courtier was ravished, and as he stepped forward to place himself right under her window, he turned to me and remarked in a self-satisfied way that among the fallen leaves no other footstep had left its mark. Then, plucking a chrysanthemum, he sang, "Strange that the music of your lute, these matchless flowers, and all the beauty of the night have lured no other feet to linger at your door." And then, beseeching her pardon for his halting verses, he begged her to play again, while one was still near who longed so passionately to hear her. When he had paid her many other compliments, the lady answered in an affected voice with the verse, "Would that I had some song that might detain the flute that blends its note with the low rustling of the autumn leaves." And after these blandishments, still unsuspecting, she took up the 13-stringed lute, and tuning it to the banjiki mode, she clattered at the strings with all the frenzy that fashion now demands. It was a fine performance, no doubt, but I cannot say that it made a very agreeable impression upon me. A man may amuse himself well enough by trifling from time to time with some lady at the court, will get what pleasure he can out of it while he is with her, and not trouble his head about what goes on when he is not there. This lady, too, I only saw from time to time, but such was her situation that I had once fondly imagined myself the only occupant of her thoughts. However, that night's work dissolved the last shred of my confidence, and I never saw her again. These two experiences, falling to my lot while I was still so young, early deprived me of any hope from women, and since that time, my view of them has but grown the blacker. No doubt to you, at your age, they seem very entrancing. These dewdrops on the grass that fall if they are touched, these glittering hailstones that melt if gathered in the hand. But when you are a little older, you will think as I do. Take my advice in this at least. Beware of caressing manners and soft, entangling ways, for if you are so rash as to let them lead you astray, you will soon find yourselves cutting a very silly figure in the world. To no Chujo, as usual, nodded his assent, and Genji's smile seemed such as to show that he too accepted Uma no Kami's advice. Your two stories were certainly very dismal, he said, laughing. And here to no Chujo interposed, I will tell you a story about myself. There was a lady whose acquaintance I was obliged to make with great secrecy, but her beauty well rewarded my pains. And though I had no thought of making her my wife, I grew so fond of her that I soon found I could not put her out of my head. And she seemed to have complete confidence in me, such confidence indeed, that when from time to time I was obliged to behave in such a way as might well have aroused her resentment. She seemed not to notice that anything was amiss, and even when I neglected her for many weeks, she treated me as though I were still coming every day. In the end, indeed, I found this readiness to receive me whenever and however I came very painful and determined for the future to merit her strange confidence. Her parents were dead, and this was perhaps why, since I was all she had in the world, she treated me with such loving meekness, despite the many wrongs I did her. I must own that my resolution did not last long, and I was soon neglecting her worse than before. During this time, I did not hear of it till afterwards. Someone who had discovered our friendship began to send her veiled messages, which cruelly frightened and distressed her, knowing nothing of the trouble she was in. Although I often thought of her, I neither came nor wrote to her for a long while. Just when she was in her worst despair, a child was born, and at last, in her distress, she plucked a blossom of the flower that is called child of my heart and sent it to me. And here to know, Chujo's eyes filled with tears. Well, said Genji, and did she write a message to go with it? Oh, nothing very out of the ordinary, said to know Chujo. She wrote, though tattered be the hillman's hedge, deign sometimes to look with kindness upon the child flower that grows so sweetly there. This brought me to her side. As usual, she did not reproach me, but she looked sad enough, and when I considered the dreary desolation of this home, where every object wore an aspect no less depressing than the wailing voices of the crickets in the grass, she seemed to me like some unhappy princess in an ancient story, and wishing her to feel that it was for the mother's sake, and not the child's, that I had come, I answered with a poem in which I called the child flower by its other name, bedflower, and she replied with a poem that darkly hinted at the cruel tempest which had attended this bedflower's birth. She spoke lightly, and did not seem to be downright angry with me, and when a few tears fell, she was at great pains to hide them, and seemed more distressed at the thought that I might imagine her to be unhappy than actually resentful of my conduct towards her. So I went away with an easy mind, and it was some while before I came again. When at last I returned, she had utterly disappeared, and if she is alive, she must be living a wretched, vagrant life. If while I still loved her, she had but shown some outward sign of her resentment, she would not have ended thus, as an outcast and wanderer, for I should never have dared to leave her so long neglected, and might in the end have acknowledged her and made her mine forever. The child too was a sweet creature, and I have spent much time in searching for them, but still without success. It is, I fear, as sorrowful a tale as that which Uma no Kami has told you. I, unfaithful, thought that I was not missed, and she, still loved, was in no better case than one whose love is not returned. I indeed am fast forgetting her, but she, it may be, cannot put me out of her mind, and I fear there may be nights when thoughts that she would gladly banish burn fiercely in her breast. For now, I fancy she must be living a comfortless and unprotected life. When all is said and done, said Uma, no Kami, my friend, though I pine for her now that she is gone, was a sad plague to me while I had her, and we must own that such a one will in the end be sure to make us wish ourselves well rid of her. The zithern player had much talent to her credit, but was a great deal too light-headed, and your diffident lady, to know Chujo, seems to me to be a very suspicious case. The world appears to be so constructed that we shall in the end be always at a loss to make a reasoned choice. Despite all our picking, sifting, and comparing, we shall never succeed in finding this in all ways and to all lengths, adorable and impeccable female. I can only suggest the goddess Kichijo said to no Chujo, and I fear that intimacy with so holy and majestic a being might prove to be impracticable. At this they all laughed, and to no Chujo continued, but now it is Shikibu's turn, and he is sure to give us something entertaining. Come, Shikibu, keep the ball rolling. Nothing of interest ever happens to humble folk like myself, said Shikibu. But to no Chujo scolded him for keeping them waiting, and after reflecting for a while which anecdote would best suit the company, he began. While I was still a student at the university, I came across a woman who was truly a prodigy of intelligence. One of Uma no Kami's demands she certainly fulfilled, for it was possible to discuss with her to advantage both public matters and the proper handling of one's private affairs. But not only was her mind capable of grappling with any problems of this kind, she was also so learned that ordinary scholars found themselves, to their humiliation, quite unable to hold their own against her. I was taking lessons from her father, who was a professor. I had heard that he had several daughters, and some accidental circumstance made it necessary for me to exchange a word or two with one of them who turned out to be the learned prodigy of whom I have spoken. The father, hearing that we had been seen together, came up to me with a wine cup in his hand and made an allusion to the poem of the two wives. Unfortunately, I did not feel the least inclination towards the lady. However, I was very civil to her, upon which she began to take an affectionate interest in me, and lost no opportunity of displaying her talents by giving me the most elaborate advice how best I might advance my position in the world. She sent me marvelous letters, written in a very far-fetched epistolary style, and entirely in Chinese characters, in return for which I felt bound to visit her, and by making her my teacher, I managed to learn how to write Chinese poems. They were wretched, knock-kneed affairs, but I am still grateful to her for it. She was not, however, at all the sort of woman whom I should have cared to have as a wife, for though there may be certain disadvantages in marrying a complete dolt, it is even worse to marry a blue stocking. Still less do princes like you and Genji require so huge a stock of intellect and erudition for your support. Let her but be one to whom the karma of our past lives draws us in natural sympathy. What matter if now and again her ignorance distresses us? Come to that, even men seem to me to get along very well without much learning. Here he stopped, but Genji and the rest, wishing to hear the end of the story, cried out that for their part they found her a most interesting woman. Shikibu protested that he did not wish to go on with the story, but at last, after much coaxing, pulling a comical wry face, he continued. I had not seen her for a long time. When at last some accident took me to the house, she did not receive me with her usual informality, but spoke to me from behind a tiresome screen. Ha, ha, thought I foolishly, she is sulking. Now is the time to have a scene and break with her. I might have known that she was not so little of a philosopher as to sulk about trifles. She prided herself on knowing the ways of the world, and my inconstancy did not in the least disturb her. She told me, speaking without the slightest tremor, that having had a bad cold, for some weeks She had taken a strong garlic cordial, which had made her breath smell rather unpleasant, and that for this reason she could not come very close to me. But if I had any matter of special importance to discuss with her, she was quite prepared to give me her attention. All this she had expressed with solemn literary perfection. I could think of no suitable reply, and with an "at your service," I rose to go. Then, feeling that the interview had not been quite a success, she added, raising her voice, "Please come again when my breath has lost its smell." I could not pretend I had not heard. I had, however, no intention of prolonging my visit, particularly as the odor was now becoming definitely unpleasant, and looking cross I recited the acrostic, "On this night marked by the strange behavior of the spider, how foolish to bid me come back tomorrow," and calling over my shoulder, "There is no excuse for you," I ran out of the room, but she, following me, if night by night, and every night we met, in daytime too, I should grow bold to meet you face to face. Here in the second sentence, she had cleverly concealed the meaning. If I had had any reason to expect you, I should not have eaten garlic. What a revolting story, cried the young princes, and then, laughing, he must have invented it. Such a woman is quite incredible. It must have been some sort of ogress. You have shocked us, Shikibu. And they looked at him with disapproval. You must try to tell us a better story than that. I do not see how any story could be better, said Shikibu, and left the room. There is a tendency among men, as well as women, said Uma no Kami, so soon as they have acquired a little knowledge of some kind, to want to display it to the best advantage. To have mastered all the difficulties in the 3 histories and 5 classics is no road to amiability. But even a woman cannot afford to lack all knowledge of public and private affairs. Her best way will be without regular study, to pick up a little here and a little there, merely by keeping her eyes and ears open. Then, if she has her wits at all about her, she will soon find that she has amassed a surprising store of information. Let her be content with this, and not insist upon cramming her letters with Chinese characters which do not at all accord with her feminine style of composition, and will make the recipient exclaim in despair. If only she could contrive to be a little less mannish, and many of these characters, to which she intended the colloquial pronunciation to be given, are certain to be read as Chinese, and this will give the whole composition an even more pedantic sound than it deserves. Even among our ladies of rank and fashion, there are many of this sort, and there are others who, wishing to master the art of verse-making, in the end allow it to master them, and, slaves to poetry, cannot resist the temptation, however urgent the business they are about, or however inappropriate the time, to make use of some happy illusion which has occurred to them, but must needs fly to their desks and work it up into a poem. On festival days, such a woman is very troublesome. For example, on the morning of the Iris festival, when everyone is busy making ready to go to the temple, she will worry them by stringing together all the old tags about the matchless route, or on the 9th day of the 9th month, when everyone is busy thinking out some difficult Chinese poem to fit the rhymes which have been prescribed. She begins making metaphors about the dew on the chrysanthemums, thus diverting our attention from the far more important business which is in hand. At another time, we might have found these compositions quite delightful, but by thrusting them upon our notice at inconvenient moments, when we cannot give them proper attention, she makes them seem worse than they really are. For in all matters we shall best commend ourselves if we study men's faces to read in them the "why so?" or the "as you will and do not," regardless of times and circumstances, demand an interest and sympathy that they have not leisure to give. Sometimes, indeed, a woman should even pretend to know less than she knows, or say only a part of what she would like to say. All this while, Genji, though he had sometimes joined in the conversation, had in his heart of hearts been thinking of one person only, and the more he thought, the less could he find a single trace of those shortcomings and excesses which, so his friends had declared, were common to all women. There is no one like her, he thought, and his heart was very full. The conversation, indeed, had not brought them to a definite conclusion, but it had led to many curious anecdotes and reflections. So they passed the night, and at last, for a wonder, the weather had improved. After this long residence at the palace, Genji knew he would be expected at the great hall and set out at once. There was in Princess Aoi's air and dress a dignified precision which had something in it even of stiffness, and in the very act of reflecting that she, above all women, was the type of that single-hearted and devoted wife whom, as his friends had said last night, no sensible man would lightly offend, he found himself oppressed by the very perfection of her beauty, which seemed only to make all intimacy with her the more impossible. He turned to Lady Chunagon, to Nakatsukasa, and other attendants of the common sort who were standing near, and began to jest with them. The day was now very hot, but they thought that flushed cheeks became Prince Genji very well. Aoi's father came, and standing behind the curtain, began to converse very amiably. Genji, who considered the weather too hot for visits, frowned, at which the ladies-in-waiting tittered. Genji, making furious signs at them to be quiet, flung himself onto a divan. In fact, he behaved far from well. It was now growing dark. Someone said that the position of the Earth star would make it unlucky for the prince to go back to the palace that night. And another, "You are right. It is now set dead against him. But my own palace is in the same direction," cried Genji. "How vexing! Where then shall I go?" And promptly fell asleep. The ladies-in-waiting, however, agreed that it was a very serious matter, and began discussing what could be done. "There is Ki no Kami's house," said one. This Ki no Kami was one of Genji's gentlemen in waiting. "It is in the middle river," she went on, "and delightfully cool and shady, for they have lately dammed the river and made it flow right through the garden." "That sounds very pleasant," said Genji, waking up. "Besides, they are the sort of people who would not mind one's driving right in at the front gate, if one had a mind to." He had many friends whose houses lay out of the unlucky direction, but he feared that if he went to one of them, Aoi would think that, after absenting himself so long, he was now merely using the Earth star as an excuse for returning to more congenial company. He therefore broached the matter to Ki no Kami, who accepted the proposal, but stepping aside, whispered to his companions that his father, Iyo no Kami, who was absent on service, had asked him to look after his young wife. "I am afraid we have not sufficient room in the house to entertain him as I could wish." Genji, overhearing this, strove to reassure him, saying, "It will be a pleasure to me to be near the lady. A visit is much more agreeable when there is a hostess to welcome us. Find me some corner behind her partition. Even then, I fear you may not find." But breaking off, Ki no Kami sent a runner to his house, with orders to make ready an apartment for the prince. Treating a visit to so humble a house As a matter of no importance, he started at once, without even informing the minister, and taking with him only a few trusted body servants. Kai no Kami protested against the precipitation, but in vain. The servants dusted and aired the eastern side chamber of the central hall, and here made temporary quarters for the prince. They were at pains to improve the view from his windows, for example by altering the course of certain rivulets. They set up a rustic wattled hedge and filled the borders with the choicest plants. The low humming of insects floated on the cool breeze. Numberless fireflies wove inextricable mazes in the air. The whole party settled down near where the moat flowed under the covered bridge and began to drink wine. Ki no Kami went off in a great bustle, saying that he must find them something to eat. Genji, quietly surveying the scene, decided this was one of those middle-class families which in last night's conversation had been so highly commended. He remembered that he had heard the lady who was staying in the house well spoken of, and was curious to see her. He listened, and thought that there seemed to be people in the western wing. There was a soft rustling of skirts, and from time to time the sound of young and by no means disagreeable voices. They did not seem to be much in earnest in their efforts to make their whispering and laughter unheard, for soon one of them opened the sliding window, but Ki no Kami, crying, "What are you thinking of?" crossly closed it again. The light of a candle in the room filtered through a crack in the paper window. Genji edged slightly closer to the window in the hope of being able to see through the crack, but found that he could see nothing. He listened for a while and came to the conclusion that they were sitting in the main women's apartments, out of which the little front room opened. They were speaking very low, but he could catch enough of it to make out that they were talking about him. What a shame that a fine young prince should be taken so young and settled down forever with a lady that was none of his choosing. "I understand that marriage does not weigh very heavily upon him," said another. This probably meant nothing in particular, but Genji, who imagined they were talking about what was uppermost in his own mind, was appalled at the idea that his relations with Lady Fujitsubo were about to be discussed. How could they have found out? But the subsequent conversation of the ladies soon showed that they knew nothing of the matter at all, and Genji stopped listening. Presently, he heard them trying to repeat the poem which he had sent with a nosegay of morning glory to Princess Asagao, daughter of Prince Momozono, but they got the lines rather mixed up, and Genji began to wonder whether the lady's appearance would turn out to be on a level with her knowledge of prosody. At this moment, Ki no Kami came in with a lamp which he hung on the wall. Having carefully trimmed it, he offered Genji a tray of fruit. This was all rather dull, and Genji, by a quotation from an old folk song, hinted that he would like to meet Ki no Kami's other guests. The hint was not taken. Genji began to doze, and his attendants sat silent and motionless. There were in the room several charming boys, sons of Ki no Kami, some of whom Genji already knew as pages at the palace. There were also numerous sons of Iyo no Kami. With them was a boy of 12 or 13, who particularly caught Genji's fancy. He began asking whose sons the boys were, and when he came to this one, Ki no Kami replied, "He is the youngest son of the late Chunagon, who loved him dearly, but died while this boy was still a child. His sister married my father, and that is why he is living here. He is quick at his books, and we hope one day to send him to court, but I fear that his lack of influence—" "Poor child," said Genji. "His sister, then, is your stepmother?" Is that not so? How strange that you should stand in this relationship with so young a girl. And now, I come to think of it, there was some talk once of her being presented at court, and I once heard the emperor asking what had become of her. How changeable are the fortunes of the world. He was trying to talk in a very grown-up way. Indeed, Sir, answered Kai no Kami, her subsequent state was humbler than she had reason to expect. But such is our mortal life. Yes, yes, and such has it always been. We have our ups and downs, and the women even more than the men. Genji. But your father no doubt makes much of her. Kai no Kami makes much of her indeed. You may well say so. She rules his house, and he dotes on her in so wholesale and extravagant a fashion that all of us, and I among the foremost, have had occasion before now to call him to order, but he does not listen. Genji. How comes it then that he has left her behind in the house of a fashionable young courtier? For he looks like a man of prudence and good sense. But pray, where is she now? Kai no Kami. The ladies have been ordered to retire to the common room, but they have not yet finished all their preparations. Genji's followers, who had drunk heavily, were now all lying fast asleep on the veranda. He was alone in his room, but could not get to sleep. Having at last dozed for a moment, he woke suddenly and noticed that someone was moving behind the paper window of the back wall. This, he thought, must be where she is hiding, and faintly curious, he sauntered in that direction and stood listening. Where are you? I say, where are you? Whispered someone in a quaint, hoarse voice, which seemed to be that of the boy whom Genji had noticed earlier in the evening. I am lying over here. Another voice answered. Has the stranger gone to sleep yet? His room must be quite close to this, but all the same how far off he seems. Her sleepy voice was so like the boy's that Genji concluded, this must be his sister. He is sleeping in the wing. I saw him tonight. All that we have heard of him is true enough. He is as handsome as can be, whispered the boy. I wish it were tomorrow. I want to see him properly. She answered drowsily, her voice seeming to come from under the bedclothes. Genji was rather disappointed that she did not ask more questions about him. Presently, he heard the boy saying, I am going to sleep over in the corner room. How bad the light is. And he seemed to be trimming the lamp. His sister's bed appeared to be in the corner opposite the paper window. Where is Chujo? She called. I am frightened. I like to have someone close to me. Madam, answered several voices from the servants' room. She is taking her bath in the lower house. She will be back presently. When all was quiet again, Genji slipped back the bolt and tried the door. It was not fastened on the other side. He found himself in an anteroom with a screen at the end, beyond which a light glimmered. In the half-darkness, he could see clothes boxes and trunks strewn about in great disorder. Quietly threading his way among them, he entered the inner room from which the voices had proceeded. One very minute figure was couched there who, to Genji's slight embarrassment, on hearing his approach, pushed aside the cloak which covered her, thinking that he was the maid for whom she had sent. Madam, hearing you call for Chujo, I thought that I might now put at your service the esteem in which I have long secretly held you. The lady could make nothing of all this, and terrified out of her wits, tried hard to scream, but no sound came, for she had buried her face in the bedclothes. Please listen, said Genji. This sudden intrusion must of course seem to you very impertinent. You do not know that for years I have waited for an occasion to tell you how much I like and admire you, and if tonight I could not resist the temptation of paying this secret visit, pray take the strangeness of my behavior as proof of my impatience to pay a homage that has long been due. He spoke so courteously and gently, and looked so kind that not the devil himself would have taken umbrage at his presence. But feeling that the situation was not at all a proper one for a married lady, she said, without much conviction, "I think you have made a mistake." She spoke very low. Her bewildered air made her all the more attractive, and Genji, enchanted by her appearance, hastened to answer, "Indeed, I have made no mistake. Rather, with no guide, but a long-felt deference and esteem, I have found my way unerringly to your side. But I see that the suddenness of my visit has made you distrust my purpose. Let me tell you, then, that I have no evil intentions and seek only for someone to talk with me for a while about a matter which perplexes me." So, saying, he took her up in his arms, for she was very small, and was carrying her through the anteroom when suddenly Chujo, the servant for whom she had sent before, entered the bedroom. Genji gave an astonished cry, and the maid, wondering who could have entered the anteroom, began groping her way towards them. But coming closer, she recognized by the rich perfume of his dress that this could be none other than the prince. And though she was sorely puzzled to know what was afoot, she dared not say a word. Had he been an ordinary person, she would soon have had him by the ears. Nay, she thought, even if he were not a prince, I should do best to keep my hands off him, for the more stir one makes, the more tongues wag. But if I should touch this fine gentleman, and all in a flutter, she found herself obediently following Genji to his room. Here he calmly closed the door upon her, saying as he did so, "You will come back to fetch your mistress in the morning." Utsusemi herself was vexed beyond measure at being thus disposed of in the presence of her own waiting maid, who could indeed draw but one conclusion from what she had seen. But to all her misgivings and anxieties, Genji, who had the art of improvising a convincing reply to almost any question, answered with such a wealth of ingenuity and tender concern that for a while she was content, but soon becoming again uneasy. This must all be a dream, that you, so great a prince, should stoop to consider so humble a creature as I, and I am overwhelmed by so much kindness. But I think you have forgotten what I am. Azurio's wife. There is no altering that. And you, Genji now began to realize how deeply he had distressed and disquieted her by his wild behavior, and feeling thoroughly ashamed of himself, he answered, "I am afraid I know very little about these questions of rank and precedence. Such things are too confusing to carry in one's head, and whatever you may have heard of me, I want to tell you for some reason or other, I have till this day cared nothing for gallantry, nor ever practiced it, and that even you cannot be more astonished at what I have done tonight than I myself am." With this, and a score of other speeches, he sought to win her confidence,